Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear before I sit down. Good. Lovely to be here again. Well, I'm Anne Sebber, and I'm a biographer. And this, as you will discover, is Julia Boyd. And I'm really delighted to be talking to you this evening about Julia's wonderful book, Travellers in the Third Reich. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Julia, and then we're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to open it up to you, and I hope you'll have lots of questions. So, Julia is a woman of many parts, and being a writer is just one of them. She started her working life at the V&A, as she told me, ironing Queen Victoria's knickers. So that obviously prepared her well for a life of being married to a diplomat. She married her diplomat husband, Sir John Boyd, in 1975, and their first posting together was Bonn, where they spent 4 very happy years. As she told me, subsequent postings were to New York, Hong Kong, and finally Tokyo. So after Japan, there was 10 years in Cambridge, where John was Master of Churchill College, which of course made Julia the Master's wife. I think that's the most wonderful title. But she was actively involved in college life there, serving as a trustee of the Winston Churchill Memorial Fund and a governor of the English-speaking Union. So now based in London, but with a sheep farm in Cumbria, which sounds wonderful. Julia is also on the board of the Wigmore Hall because music is a passion. So music will be one of the areas we'll be discussing. Julia's written 4 books before this one, and I think that this obviously owes much to her time in Germany, as you'll discover. But I also think that being a diplomat's wife, and I'm sure you're a diplomat yourself in the broadest sense, really qualifies you to write this book because you're an outsider. But on the other hand, you look for the best in what you find. And I think this is an extraordinary document. It's really a terribly important book to try and understand the years when Hitler was in power, as you'll all know, from 1933 to when the Nuremberg laws against the Jews were introduced, and then finally war. And this mixture of travellers that you found who went there and what they found and how they wrote about it. It really, there were times when I was reading this and I had to stop and I thought, this is so extraordinary. And of course, one uses hindsight, and that's a terrible danger to read it with hindsight. But what comes across in this book is the freshness of it all, how people saw it at the time. So first of all, how did you get the idea for it? Where did it start?
Well, it wasn't my idea at all. It was suggested to me, and I must admit, I thought it was a completely nutty idea. I mean, the idea that I would have anything to contribute to a subject about which probably more has been written in my lifetime than any other, and by some of our most eminent historians, I thought it was just frankly ludicrous. But my earlier books had taught me one thing, and that is there is an awful lot of raw, unfiltered history out there, if you like, in unpublished diaries, letters, memoirs, obscure books long since forgotten, and correspondence columns in, not just necessarily the main newspapers, but provincial ones. So if you can tap into all this, you do get a rather different perspective. So I started looking, and of course immediately began to find all kinds of interesting things.
Well, you're obviously a demon researcher, and I do want to talk about how you found the material, because it's not so easy when you think, oh, it's such a well-trawled subject.
Well, that's true.
But just before we go there, I mean, it seems obvious in retrospect that I think it was Bonn, obviously, where you were based. 4 years in Bonn in the 1970s.
Well, late 70s, early 80s, yes.
Well, it's not the same as Berlin or Oberammergau or Bayreuth in the 30s. So merely because you were there in the 70s. But I suppose what interested me was whether, because you'd met good Germans, ordinary Germans, decent Germans, it made you think, well, how did our ancestors view them? I mean, am I right in thinking
yes,
that
you're
must
absolutely right. I mean, we spent a lot of time wondering how these extraordinarily nice people who were so devoted to their families, to their jobs, who were so decent, who loved classical music, who were so civilized, how is it possible that, you know, there were so many Nazis about? How is it possible that these people could have gone down this path? And I'm not sure, even having spent whatever it is, four years or something, trying to explore this very question, I'm not sure that I have a complete answer. But as far as the people who were traveling in Germany between the wars were concerned, I think, I've got a little collection of little quotes here, but I think Louis MacNeice in a poem, I think probably summed it up. He said, but that, we thought to ourselves, was not our business. All that the tripper wants is the status quo, cut and dried for trippers. And we thought the papers a lark with their party politics and blank invective. So I think a lot of travellers went to Nazi Germany just not prepared to really explore what was going on. They just took what they saw for granted.
Well, one of the lovely things about this book are the pictures, and some of them show holiday makers, people in caravans, Thomas Cook. I mean, Germany was a great tourist destination for walking.
Absolutely.
So how did you start to find, you know, where was the first really extraordinary account of what it was like to be in Germany?
A lot of, I mean, this book really is a book about its sources, and finding them, to be honest, a lot of it is just pure luck. I'll give you an example.
No, it's not luck, it's hard work.
Well,
Don't ever let anyone...
This was real luck, because one of the first people I came across was a young New Zealander called Geoffrey Cox, who, after the war, became a very distinguished television journalist. But in the early 30s, he was a Rhodes Scholar, and he wanted to spend a couple of summers in Germany. So in other words, he was exactly the sort of person who I wanted to track down and read the letters and diaries that he was writing at the time. But I got absolutely nowhere. And then I was up in the Lake District on a particularly cold day in Zedbo, where there's a very good bookshop. And I asked the owner of the bookshop if she had any books on Germany in the 30s. And she said, no, she said, but funnily enough, you should ask that, because my father was there in the 1930s. Yeah. Oh, I said, and what was his name? Geoffrey Cox. And, I mean, that then led to his letters, and he was one of, you know, my sort of rather good witnesses. So there is a lot of luck.
And you were telling me about that amazing picture. I mean, those of you who are experts, and I guess many of you, if you've come to this session, you'll probably be quite familiar with the photographs of Hitler. You know, I know from my book, In Paris, Hitler only went to Paris for one day. So there's this very famous picture of Hitler with the Eiffel Tower behind him. And when Wallace and Edward met Hitler, there's the one photograph that everybody shows. You've produced this photograph of Hitler meeting ordinary English people. I mean, it's extraordinary. So how did that come about?
That was, again, very like a great friend of mine happened to be at a dinner party in London, sitting next to some random man she'd never met before. Somehow or other, they got into the subject of Germany, and she said she had this friend writing the book. And he said, oh, I've got this extraordinary photograph of Hitler, which was taken near Berchtesgaden in 1935, with a group of ordinary British tourists. And it transpired that this photograph was taken of the Matthews family. It was taken, obviously, by the father, who's not in the photograph, and he was a GP in Bournemouth. And he was very proud of this photograph, so he displayed it in his surgery in Bournemouth, even after the war began, until a police constable came round one day and said he thought, on the whole, it might be a good idea if he put the photograph away, at least until after the war. so, I mean, you know, that was just a complete luck.
No, but it's a real coup. And I think putting all this together is what makes it so extraordinary. I mean, I did wonder, because most people who went to Germany went there because they loved it. And that includes many Jewish people as well, and many young girls were sent there to finishing schools. But by and large, most people who went there wanted to go because they loved Germany. So it must have been quite difficult to find opponents who went there.
Well, it was, yes, I mean, on the whole, I mean, really people divided, I suppose, into sort of three groups. There were tourists who just went to have a good holiday. And of course, Germany was a wonderful place for a holiday. The hotels were clean and comfortable, and the Germans were very welcoming to the British and the Americans, not to the French, but to the Brits and the Americans. And British people were constantly surprised at how warm and friendly ordinary Germans were to them, and didn't seem to bear any grudges about the First World War. And then there were people, of course, who went for professional reasons, who wanted to learn more about Nazi Germany or were going there for work. But it was in my experience that most people that went to Germany had already made up their minds what they felt about it, even before they went. And there were very few people that had their minds changed by actually being there. And I think it was the same for people who went to the Soviet Union. They went expecting to confirm their idea of the country rather than challenge it.
You're going to read one thing about somebody who really did change their mind, so why not read it now?
Okay,
I'll think
do that.
There are a number of areas I'd love to pick up on what you said. But
well, this is a passage which I thought might be of interest because it's about the American novelist Thomas Wolfe. And as I say, in my experience, very few people went to Germany and changed their mind about it. He absolutely adored Germany. He was really in love with the country, and he went many times during the 1930s. His books were very successful there, and he was treated as a celebrity, as a literary lion. And I picked this passage because, as I say, he is one of the few people I came across whose feelings about Germany were changed by what happened to him there. The Germany that Wolfe loved so much was essentially a land of romantic beauty where, and I quote, "the green is the greenest green on earth, and which gives to all its foliage a kind of forest darkness, a legendary sense of magic and of time." And he's equally persuasive when describing the urban scene. Even the little cobblestones that paved the tramway were spotless, as if each of them had just been gone over thoroughly with a whisk broom, and the strips of grass on either side were as green and velvety as Oxford sward. Although friends like Martha Dodd, who was the communist daughter of the American ambassador, did their best to open Wolfe's eyes, he was as reluctant to let go his German idyll as he was to be influenced by the views of others. But although after that particular trip, he returned to America with his illusions largely intact, seeds of doubt had begun to take root. A year later, he was back in Germany for a long holiday. When it was over, he left Berlin by the Paris train on the first leg of the journey home. At the frontier town of Aachen, there was a scheduled stop of 15 minutes, and it was here that he experienced his Damascene moment. Having become friendly with his fellow passengers, he strolled with them along the platform as they all waited to reboard the train. But as they returned to their compartment, it was clear that some terrible crisis had occurred. Wolfe instantly recognized the signs. You do not know, of course, the precise circumstance, but what you sense immediately is the final stage of tragedy. Even before one arrives, one knows from this silent eloquence of shoulders, backs, and heads that something ruinous and horrible has happened. It quickly emerged that this particular drama centered on another of Wolfe's fellow travelers, a nervous little man with whom he had conversed all morning and had nicknamed Fuss and Fidget. It was only now that Wolfe discovered that his new friend was Jewish and had been caught trying to leave Germany with a large sum of money. The official who arrested him, Wolfe noted, had high, blunt cheekbones, a florid face, and tawny moustaches. His head was shaven, and there were thick creases at the base of the skull and across his fleshy neck. Although until this moment Wolfe had not particularly concerned himself with the plight of the Jews, he now found himself, and I quote, trembling with murderous and incomprehensible anger. I wanted to smash that fat neck with the creases in it. I wanted to pound that inflamed and blunted face into a jelly. But I knew that I was helpless, that all of us were. I felt impotent, shackled, unable to stare against the walls of an obscene but unshakable authority. There was, however, one weapon Woolf did have in his power to deploy, his pen. But as he well knew, publication of the story would come at great personal cost. His books would be banned in Germany, and he would never again be able to visit the country that he so adored. His novella, I Have a Thing to Tell You, was published a few months after he returned to America. It's a powerful piece that concludes with a touching goodbye. To that old German land, he wrote, with all the measure of its truth, its glory, beauty, and magic, to that dark land, to that old ancient earth that I have loved so long, I said farewell.
So he was courageous, and he stands out in this book. There aren't as many. In fact, there aren't many people at all who come out of it smelling of roses, I think, other than the Quakers, who you bookend the book with, both at the beginning and the end. But I just wanted to pick up, you mentioned Martha Dodd, and for those of you who don't know, she was the daughter of the American ambassador. And the American ambassador was a very interesting academic, arguably,
yes,
you might say, out of his depth. Now, what I wanted to ask you was, you know, she also had extreme views and affairs with almost everyone, yes, it seems, from the Russians and
Nazis to Russians.
Yes, yes. And whether she was a double or triple agent, who knows? But Martha Dodd aside, she throws into sharp relief, perhaps, the British diplomats. And I wondered what your views were. So we start with Rumbold.
Rumbold, well... And then
Eric
Phipps, who was...
And then Neville Henderson, who everybody remembers, because Neville Henderson was the one at the time of Chamberlain. So do you think that their views of, obviously, love for Germany, that's why they were there, but of appeasement and believing that actually Hitler could be dealt with rationally? What's your feeling on that?
Phipps certainly didn't. Rumbold didn't really. No, Rumbold was always writing dispatches warning about the Nazis, and so was Phipps. Phipps was a very funny man. He, in one of his dispatches back to the Foreign Office, he said he'd just had a particularly difficult interview with Hitler, who had ranted and raved. And one of Hitler's aides had written to Phipps afterwards saying that Hitler had been so exhausted by the interview that he'd had to go and calm himself down by drinking lots of cold water and eating lots of cabbage. And Phipps wrote that he too had been very stressed after this interview, but he had sought to calm himself down by rather different methods. Phipps was a wonderfully funny man, absolutely loathed the Nazis. Henderson was an appeaser. And I think the only thing one can say about Henderson that he did have cancer and he was ill for a lot of the time, but he doesn't come out of it well. But there were other diplomats who wrote about the Nazis very perceptively, both in the American embassy and in the British embassy.
Well, perhaps we should talk more about politicians as well, or the sort of people who went, and army people. I mean, Lloyd George is extraordinary.
Lloyd George is extraordinary.
Do tell the story of Lloyd George, because it beggars belief almost.
It does beg a belief. I mean, Lloyd George, well, Hitler was very impressed by Lloyd George. He flattered him. He said, of course, your country has you to thank for winning the war and so on. And Lloyd George sort of just soaked all this up. And when the letter he wrote to Hitler afterwards was just so over the top. And but Lloyd George wasn't the only one. I mean, one of the things that I found really astonishing was how one establishment figure after another returned to England saying, the word they always used was sincere. So they said, whatever else you may think about Hitler, he is so sincere. And it is extraordinary. He seems to have managed to convince people of his sincerity in a quite extraordinary way. Not Eric Phipps. And Eric Phipps had a terrible time trying to persuade people who just had an interview with Hitler and said, well, what a charming man he is. And, you know, trying to persuade them how different it was when he was talking to him. But it was everybody from the Aga Khan to to endless politicians who you feel somehow ought to have known better. But Hitler clearly did have the ability to pull the wool over people's eyes. And of course, it was against a background of really quite a strong feeling of guilt. And now, of course, it's being re-looked at, and the whole business of the Treaty of Versailles and so on is thought to have been not as unfair as has been a lot of current thinking. But at the time, in the 30s, I think many people felt that the Germans had had a very raw deal after the First World War, and that it was time for us now to, give them a helping hand. And the other thing that I think is really worth mentioning, it was very striking to a lot of foreign travellers in Nazi Germany. They were very impressed by the idealism, particularly of the young people. And I know for us it's hard to imagine that National Socialism was idealistic. The young people who worked on the farms or went and worked in the labour groups, they really did feel they wanted to work for their country. They'd been through this hideous time after the First World War with hyperinflation and starvation and poverty and so on, and they wanted to build their country up. So many Brits travelling in Germany were very impressed by this, particularly when they thought of, the unemployed youths back in England. And they felt that Hitler was investing, obviously, in infrastructure, and there was a sort of sense of purpose in Germany that was lacking back home.
One of the other asides that you touched on was the anti-French feeling. Now, that, of course, is bound up in the Treaty of Versailles. It was believed by many of the people who you write about that the French had been vindictive and unfair, and there was huge anti-French feeling. It's one of the really strong themes of this book.
Well, there were many surprises for me because although, like most of us, I had a sort of fairly good background knowledge of the Nazi period, I'd never made an in-depth study of it. So a lot of things surprised me. And this anti-French feeling right after the armistice, I've got quotes from both American and British soldiers saying how literally weeks after the armistice, how they so much preferred the Germans to the French. And there was a sense that the French were sort of untrustworthy and immoral, and there was a real sense that the Germans were our true cousins, fellow Anglo-Saxons. They were, we shared the same work ethics and so on. And that was astonishing to me. But it was, anti-French sentiment was expressed by people from all different walks of life, and really right through this interwar period.
Well, I think that's particularly noticeable with the idea, you say that there was a strong feeling in England that the Germans were our cousins, but also this feeling that Germany was really the country of culture. This was the country of great music, great poetry, great drama, and a lot of people who went, of course, to Bayreuth or to Oberammergau. I mean, I wonder what you have to say about that and the musical connections and the belief that a country with such culture couldn't possibly turn against its Jewish inhabitants, whereas if anywhere in Europe was going to turn, it was going to be the French. I mean, look at Dreyfus. So
yes.
That was
I think that's absolutely right. I don't think you can underestimate the importance of German culture on our own intellectual life. I mean, it was essential to know, obviously, German music, German literature, Goethe, Kant, and this was really a fundamental part of sort of British education. And so it was very natural to send young men who were going to the Foreign Office or become establishment figures to go and spend time in Germany. And there was always some impoverished Baronin who would put them up for very little money. And it was one of the things that really did surprise me, that so many young people were roaming around in Germany right up until the eve of the Second World War.
Having a wonderful time.
Well, Darwin's grandson was there, Arnold Toynbee's son was there. And I think, what was going on in these people's heads? Did they not read the newspapers? And I think there was a sort of disconnect between what was happening in Nazi Germany, and there was plenty of anecdotal evidence. I mean, you know, Dachau opened 7 weeks after Hitler came to power. There was the first, the boycott of Jewish shops on the 1st of April. There was the book burning in May, all in 1933. So it wasn't as if people didn't know. And yet British intellectuals and, well, the upper classes sent their children there because many of them openly supported Hitler. But the left-wing liberals, why?
Dachau you talk about, and that comes back to Lloyd George. I mean, that was one of the stories I hadn't heard, that when Lloyd George went to Dachau, the prison guards dressed up as prisoners, pretending to be prisoners, so he came away saying, oh, they're so well fed and they're all smiling. And he took away a souvenir of a beer.
Well, that was Admiral Domville, yes.
Oh,
that's right, yes.
Well,
but no, you're absolutely right. Because
I'm mixing
no,
up
you're
the
not
stories.
at all. You're absolutely right, because one of the Nazis' tricks was to, they showed off Dachau as, you know, journalists and politicians were keen to go there and see it for themselves. And they did indeed disguise the guards as prisoners. And it was, at the beginning at least, they were quite keen for people to show them around this camp so they could go home and say, yes, well, you know, after all, Germany's just been through a revolution and they're not killing their enemies, they are reforming them. And they stopped doing that after a while, but a lot of British and American journalists did visit Dachau.
Yes, I think we should criticise the journalists. We've criticised the diplomats and the politicians.
Do you know,
I think it's time to criticise.
I think the journalists were the heroes here. I mean, the journalists were the people who, right from the beginning after Hitler came to power, were trying to write what was really happening. They were travelling all over the country. They saw the repression, the suppression, the cruelty, the brutality, and they did write about it. But very often their editors cut it, or I mean, for instance, Geoffrey Dawson, who was the editor of the Times, was always cutting Frank Ebert's articles.
As an appeaser.
As an appeaser. His wife was German, actually. And so the journalists were, people didn't want to know. They didn't want another war. The last thing they wanted to do was to believe these newspaper reports. So it was much easier to think, well, you know, newspapers always exaggerate. It's not really that bad. And, you know, they've just had a revolution. It'll calm down. And the anti-Semitism will calm down too. Once Hitler gets himself sorted out, things will improve. And I'm afraid that really was the sort of background attitude. You can understand why, because people so dreaded the thought of another war. But in the end, of course, it was counterproductive.
We must, I think, talk about this underlying anti-Semitism and why the underlying, if you like, casual anti-Semitism, but there's nothing casual about it, was allowed to flourish. And one can say that, well, it was in the air, it was how people spoke in those days, but that's not really an answer. I mean...
It was shocking. I mean, I will quote you this, because when I read this, and I really could not believe it. This is Maynard Keynes, the famous economist. The letter's in the Bodleian. It's actually published too. And it's Maynard Keynes writing in I think it's 1926, might have been 1928, he'd just been to Berlin and he'd met Einstein and Karl Melchior and various other very distinguished Jews. And he wrote to a friend when he came back saying, "Yet if I lived there, I felt I might turn anti-Semitic, for the poor Prussian is too slow and heavy on his legs for the other kind of Jews, the ones who are not imps, but serving devils with small horns, pitchforks, and oily tails. It is not agreeable to see civilization so under the ugly thumbs of its impure Jews, who have all the money and the power and the brains." Well, I mean, you know, that is quite extraordinary. And yet Maynard Keynes was one of the first people, as the persecution of Jews gathered pace in the 1930s, he was one of the first people to go out there and do something positive about it, to welcome Jewish refugees. So there was this widespread, casual anti-Semitism that was just a sort of, people didn't think about it. It just sort of came out. But I think it did terrible harm in as much as it created an atmosphere that made people like Hitler think that, you know, it was it was much more deeply rooted than it was.
And that people wouldn't respond. I mean, I too mark passages like that, truly are sick-making. And I think it's important that we recognise people were able to write that sort of article with impunity.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, I have several thoughts. I was asked, giving a talk only yesterday, a survivor in the audience said to me, I was talking about France, how do you explain the anti-Semitism in France? And my stock answer is, I can't. You can rationalise it, but actually I think that's damaging to rationalise it, because I don't think it is rational, and I don't think... But, we struggle. And you read this, and I wonder, was there ever a point where you discovered things that you thought, I just can't repeat that? I mean, there must have been...
Well, I find that's very hard to repeat. And then there was another, Rumbold, Sir Horace Rumbold was an intelligent, clever man who was ambassador in Berlin between 1928 and 1933. He was absolutely against the Nazis, and he was horrified by their treatment of the Jews. And yet he wrote, and I won't bother you with another quotation, something equally shocking on British embassy writing paper. Again, it's in the Bodleian. So what was happening here? I mean, what was going on? I'm just not quite sure myself.
As you reflect on all of this, which I'm sure you must have done many times, do you think in retrospect, with this wonderful tool, hindsight, that anything could have been different, or actually...
I don't think that when it comes to the Second World War, I don't think there's anything really that would have changed that. I think that public opinion, even if the establishment figures had not come back from after meeting Hitler saying what a wonderful, sincere man he was, even if, I don't know, perhaps if we'd gone into the Rhineland when Hitler went in there.
In 1936, I agree with you. I think 1936 was
But you see, the public opinion wasn't there. I mean,
no.
You cannot get away from the horror of the First World War. And just people wanted to avoid another war at all costs. So I think it was very... I don't actually believe myself that anything that we could have done really would have changed that course of events. I think, unfortunately, the Depression came at a very bad moment. After Hitler's putsch and trial, he was able to give his views very wide publicity at the time of his trial. But after that, after he was released, it really went quite quiet for the Nazis. Things were going better economically for Germany, and I can't help feeling if 1929 and the Depression hadn't happened, maybe the Nazis wouldn't have got their foot in the door. But who knows? I mean, I certainly have no...
Churchill wasn't ready and wouldn't have been popular. There are lots of many moving sections in your book, and I think actually the number of soldiers' organisations who went trying to create links between British and German soldiers, thinking they could have, nobody wanted this bloodshed of World War I, and I think that's one of the saddest aspects, really, that they went with no preconceived notions, but just trying in the hope that if there were links between the two, perhaps that would avoid. But
there were some very touching stories, but even they were taken in, I mean, the British Legion sent a delegation, and they were all very well-meaning, but completely naive about the Nazis. And of course, the Nazis were terribly good at stage managing things. So
which you do talk about with the Olympics, because of course the big set piece 1936 Olympics, everything, wonderful. But one American stayed on. Do you want to talk about that? That was
yes. I mean,
and saw how immediate it was dismantled.
What was the jingle that was going on? When the Olympic Games are done, then with Jews we'll have some fun, or something like this. And of course, the moment the foreigners went away, all the notices forbidding Jews to go there were put back again. And it completely changed, literally within 24 hours. But the Nazis were very effective propagandists, as we all know, and they were also extremely efficient and ran everything very beautifully. So foreigners went away thinking, well, you know, the Nazis close up are really not so bad, and they'd had a wonderful time.
I just wanted to ask you about some of the musical set pieces. I mean, Toscanini was very brave. I mean, he was part Jewish, so
Yes, he was. But there was a very funny story about Toscanini, because when he conducted, I think it was Tannhäuser, there was this, the idea that a foreigner, an Italian, could conduct Wagner was complete anathema to the Wagnerites. And so when Toscanini conducted, I think, forgotten, was it 1930, I think, and it was a phenomenal success. And this was really awkward, because how is it possible that a Latin could conduct Wagner? But then someone managed to do a bit of digging around and found that Toscanini had been born in Parma, and Parma was in North Italy, where it was well known they were all Aryans, and so it was all made all right. Although Toscanini actually did not behave like an Aryan. He got terribly cross with the first violins in rehearsal and stamped his foot and broke his baton over his knee, so wasn't nothing very Aryan about his behaviour. But no, he, in the end, walked out and wouldn't have any more to do with it.
But the other musical anecdote that I picked up on was Thomas Beecham, who caved in. Thomas Beecham, when told he couldn't play Mendelssohn, agreed. Well, now, should we expect better from Thomas Beecham?
We should. I think this was, I mean, Thomas Beecham was like a number of people who didn't like the Nazis, but when they were offered an opportunity to go there, you know, they just couldn't resist it. He had the opportunity to take his new orchestra on tour of Germany, and he shouldn't, I think, really have gone. But then, you know, there's this dilemma. Do you go and hope that you're giving help and hope to people who are being oppressed, or do you not go? And I don't know. I mean, in Thomas Beecham's case, I think it was probably a mistake. I don't think he should have gone.
But it's easy for us to say.
But it's easy for us to say. And yes, and I mean, a lot of people didn't like the Nazis, but they did love the Germany that they'd known. Many of them had studied there, and they just sort of hoped that the Nazis would go away, I think, and that the old Germany, the Germany they all loved, with the music and the art and the culture and everything, would somehow still be there intact.
And that it wouldn't fall to the awful Bolsheviks and communists, and that it was better than that. Just, I'm looking at the clock and I see it's time to open up to the floor, but just before we do that, I do want to finish on a sort of upbeat note in my questions to you, and there's such a lovely anecdote that you open the book with, and
yes.
I'd love you to tell that.
Yes, well, when I first started doing this book, you know, I sort of talked to people, and a friend of mine in Cambridge came up with this extraordinary story concerning her parents, who lived in Kenya, or Kenya as it was called then, and they were married there, and they came back to Europe for a honeymoon, decided to go to Germany, as so many people did, drive in through Aachen and then drive up the Rhine. And when they got to Frankfurt, our car had a GB sticker on it, which was always a great magnet for Germans. When the moment they saw a GB, they would cluster around the car, and they were very friendly to the Brits, which surprised people very often. Anyway, they were just getting out of their car to go and explore Frankfurt, which, of course, before it was bombed, was the most beautiful medieval city, when this Jewish-looking woman approached them and holding the hand of her child, who was wearing a thick, built-up shoe and thick glasses. And the woman came straight up to this young couple and begged them to take her daughter to England with them. And you know, it's an extraordinary thing to do, but the mother of my friend said yes, she would take the girl, because she had seen enough of what was going on in Germany to realize that the prospects for a disabled Jewish girl were hopeless. And so she said, let's take her, we will. But she had to explain to the mother that they were not going back to England, they were going to Africa. And I think it's the most poignant thing that this mother was prepared to give her disabled child to complete strangers who were not even going to England, but were going to Africa. But I have a photograph of this girl who went back to Kenya and looked after my friend as a baby, called Greta. Unfortunately, nobody knows what happened to her, but it is the most extraordinary, touching story. And I mean, it made me search my own heart and mind.
Well, that's
what would I have done?
Yeah.
Would I have taken that? You know, I'm sure I would have said, oh, I'm terribly sorry. I would love to take your daughter, and I do hope she will be all right. But, you know, it's a bit awkward because I don't think I really can. And yet this couple took this girl and saved her life.
And your friend is the
it's the daughter, yes.
So
well, she was looked after. She was a baby. I mean, she's now 80, she was looked after by this German girl. And now, having told me this story and let me use it in the book, she's, of course, mortified that she didn't keep track. And we've tried looking at ships lists and things, but we haven't been able to track her down.
It is a really extraordinary story for all the reasons you say. What would I have done, which is the number one. But also it really indicates that there were some people who very clearly saw what was going on. Absolutely. And I think that's why it's such a powerful story. Well, I've got lots more questions, but I know it's your turn. So I guess there are probably mics that'll come to you. So if you've got a question, please put your hand up.
Thank you very much. So you said, I think, in the book that really from 1936 it was common knowledge what was going on in Nazi Germany. Do you see any parallels with our present world, with Russia and Turkey and Syria?
Well, I think there are a lot of people are writing and finding parallels. I think parallels are perhaps a slightly strong word. I would say echoes. I mean, I think where I do feel there is an echo is weak democracies produce extremists. And I think democracy hasn't had a terribly easy time of it recently. And I mean, you know, you can't help looking at Germany and the weak coalition at the moment, and the Alternative for Deutschland is now the main opposition party. I don't for a moment think, don't let me suggest, I wouldn't want you to think that I was suggesting for a moment that we're going to have a rerun of the Nazis, but nevertheless, it does make you think how, you know, it happened in the 30s. And so I don't think it's going to happen, but I think that there are some slightly worrying echoes from the 30s, and you know, I just hope that these extremist parties that are causing us all to think rather long and hard are going to not get the kind of foothold, obviously, that the Nazis did. But when you say common knowledge, I think it was possible to go to Germany up until the late 30s, and it wasn't totally unreasonable to give the Nazis the benefit of the doubt. I mean, people were very pleased to see the renewal of self-confidence. People wanted to see Germany recover, and they were impressed by the determination the Germans had to get back on top. They wanted to see Germany strong and taking a major part in European affairs. And of course, there was this feeling which the Nazis pushed endlessly, that it was only Hitler that stood between the red tide that was going to sweep across Europe. But I personally think that, as I said, there were plenty of press reports saying what was going on in Germany. There was plenty of anecdotal evidence from people returning. And I think after 1935 and the Nuremberg laws, and then there can have been really no excuse, in my view, after Kristallnacht. Although, I mean, can I just quote you this? This was Thomas Cook in, if I can find it. This was Thomas Cook in 1939, encouraging people to go on holiday in the summer of 1939 to Germany. All the old enchantment is there, and much that will impress you tremendously, and everywhere. Everywhere you will meet with that comfort, kindliness, and good fare that is the first essential of an enjoyable holiday. Well, you know, it's extraordinary, isn't it? So I think personally that 1935 was a real cut-off point for the Nuremberg laws, and absolutely no excuse for anybody to think that Nazi Germany was a nice, cosy place to go after Kristallnacht.
But I guess part of it is that nobody could believe it. I mean, as Jews, one knew that after the Nuremberg laws were introduced, Jews couldn't work. So anyone who had any connection with Jews, but for the rest of the world, there was this feeling, oh, it can't possibly be. But the journalists, as you say, there were reports and people could know, but there was this desire to believe that...
I think that's right. I think people wanted to believe the best in Germany, and I think they just wanted to believe that it was going to be all right. And of course, it wasn't.
And the desire not to go to war, and in answer to your question, I think that is all pervasive now. You know, where do we interfere? Where is it our business? And if we go to war, do we make it worse? So, I mean, I find the echoes extraordinary, but...
Somebody over there,
yes.
I think.
Thank you. On the theme of journalists, I wondered whether in your research you'd looked at what the Jewish Chronicle had said over the period that we're talking about in terms of journalism and so forth, because they must have been presumably getting pretty excited about it.
You're quite right, and I'm afraid I have to say I didn't. But I was always looking for people who were travelling to Germany, rather than looking at. And somebody once asked me, "Did I look at the BBC?" I suppose I was on a slightly different track, because I was just always looking for as wide a range of travellers as possible, but particularly people who wrote about their experiences there and then. I mean, I didn't want anybody writing about how they felt about their travels in the 1930s in Germany after the war. And people like Stephen Spender, for instance, if you read what he wrote at the time, and then you read his autobiography, World Within Worlds, people can't help it. I don't even think they did it consciously, but if after the war they wrote about how Germany struck them before the war, they immediately start putting in things about, well, I was aware of the terrible atmosphere and this. And so that's why I tried very hard to stick with what
Primary
people wrote
sources.
there and then and before the war. So I'm afraid I didn't look at the Jewish Chronicle, but I probably should have done.
But you've looked at absolutely everything else.
Yes.
One thing which has always puzzled me is that, leaving aside for a moment for concentration camps, there was gigantic remilitarization. Lots of troops were being trained all over Germany. And there must have been a large number of no-go areas where travelers simply couldn't go. And I've often wondered if there was any reflection of that in travelers' experiences. Did they stumble by accident on something they shouldn't see?
Nothing actually springs to mind immediately. I do remember Geoffrey Cox, who I mentioned at the beginning. He actually did something rather remarkable. He went and worked in a labour camp for a few weeks, and he said they were always they played this game which he was particularly good at, where you threw a grenade or something into a target area, and he used to say, well, this is military training, isn't it? And they said, oh, no, this is a well-known schoolboy game that we all play in Germany. So there's that, but I don't think I remember coming across any example of a traveller finding themselves in a sort of military zone or suddenly being arrested because they'd stumbled on. Interestingly enough, the oral descriptions from athletes in the Olympics, they were driven backwards and forwards between the village and the stadium, and they mentioned they saw people sort of with camouflage and big packs crawling through the woods, you know. And one of them said it was extraordinary. In the bus, there were these funny things round the edge, and he kept asking the driver what they were for. Eventually, he discovered that they were the sort of sockets for gun emplacements. So the bus that was driving them to and fro the stadium could be turned into a military vehicle within minutes. But there are sort of observations like that, but I don't think I came across anyone actually stumbling into a military exercise or anything.
Julia, did you find any evidence of British Jews going to Germany and writing any accounts of it?
British Jews going to Germany then? Well, I did come across one rather odd story. A friend of mine she's just died, but she was a doctor in Cambridge, and she and her sister went with their mother on several holidays to Germany in the late 30s. And the mother was always making anti-Semitic remarks. And it was only years later they discovered that their mother was herself of German Jewish origins. The grandparents had come to England at a very early stage. And I thought, what an extraordinary thing, as knowing that you were Jewish, to actually take your family on holiday to Germany in the late 30s. And you sort of wonder what was going on in her head. But otherwise, I suppose there must have been British Jews who went to Germany, but I can't think of anybody immediately. That was the question was, what did but just going to work there. Don't think so. Not nothing I can think of instantly. Though there must, I don't know. There must have been
Presumably Jewish academics went over to exchange thoughts with you.
Well, there was when there was the what was it, the 500th anniversary of Heidelberg University. The Brits didn't send delegates in protest. Harvard did, Columbia did, but the French and the British did not. I think probably very few Jewish academics would have wanted to go to Germany because, they'd all been dismissed from their posts. So there was one young woman who was doing her PhD at Cambridge, who went to Germany in 1936, and she went and she watched the fireworks in Heidelberg, and they went to the house of a Jewish professor who'd been dismissed from his post, and they said there was no real stigma attached to this Jewish professor, except that he wasn't allowed to employ a maid under 45. But otherwise, her German friends, treated them perfectly normally. But I think the British universities did not send Jewish academics to Germany, as far as I know. I mean, I think that we did take a stand, but American universities certainly did, and tried to pretend that, there wasn't really any political discrimination going on in it, which was ridiculous because, as we all know, most Jewish professors were dismissed from their posts.
Any other questions?
Gillian?
I was just surprised by the sort of feeling of peaceableness in terms of the English visitors to Germany. And I'm wondering if any of them who went into print then got attacked once they were back by, what was a huge anti-German feeling of those who'd been through the First World War, or those who'd lost children, or, all the other things. I mean, I'm not sort of getting a sense of that anger, which You know, my father fought in the First World War, so I mean, I even had it at home. So it's just kind of an interesting.
This is one of the things that surprised me
lack.
most about the book, is that how little anger there was. Because, you know, I grew up thinking, you know, I mean, hearing about Dachshunds that were killed because they were Dachshunds and so on. And I would have expected, particularly, obviously, amongst veterans, to have been a real anger and hatred, Germany. And it was quite extraordinary how people flocked to Germany between the wars for holidays, and how soldiers and their families went, and how little hatred there was of Germany, and how people felt there was this strong bond between us Anglo-Saxons. So, and so many soldiers did not feel this great hatred to the Germans. They felt much more dislike of the French than the Germans. I mean, it was one of the real surprises to me. And how, I think, after the Second World War, it really was different, but between the wars, so many people went to Germany on holiday. It was perhaps the prime holiday destination in the 30s, which does seem extraordinary. But I didn't come across any hatred of Germans from the military. On the contrary, the opposite.
I think it's really, if you can be really, really quick.
Yes. Actually, I'll just to reiterate perhaps what you've been saying, there was no, you know, sort of desire to war with Germany, and Hitler, in fact, probably got the wrong war, because he wanted to ally with us against the Red Menace.
Of course.
And
yes.
of course he ended up completely wrong because of what he did against Poland. You know, up till then, everybody had seemed to have stood, you know, for what he'd said, and as you say, there was even their love of the English aristocracy was, I think, something I've read about. So, you know, what you've been saying seems
Yes,
to
well,
be...
I think you're absolutely... I mean, Hitler said the happiest day of his life was when Germany and Britain signed, I think it was, I've forgotten which agreement it was now, but, you know, that they were so desperate to get the Brits on side and to be allied to us. But there really wasn't a strong anti-German feeling between. There really was a feeling that the Germans had not been treated particularly well, and that we should really now forget the past and come together with them, but not to the. I mean, obviously, from Hitler's point of view, it was a great disappointment that he could never get that ultimate agreement with us.
I could ask you lots more questions. I just want to say and answer that, first of all, thank you very much for sharing it with us and for producing what I know will be a hugely valuable document for a long time to come for anyone writing about this period. But just perhaps in answer to Gillian's question, the complexity, the nuances, I think, of all the stories. There's a woman who I think was Ursula Duncan-Jones, whose father was Dean of Chichester Cathedral. Her father took in a Jewish refugee, so he knew perfectly well, but at the same time, he sent his daughter to Germany right up until, wasn't that in 39?
My own mother, was in Germany until a few weeks before the outbreak of war. And she'd been staying with German family. I mean, you know, what were they thinking? I mean, you know, she was
human beings are complicated
really
and
extraordinary. That you should let your 17-year-old daughter wander around Nazi Germany in June 1939.
And that was your mother.
That was my mother. And her father was certainly, my grandfather was, you know, he sponsored a Jewish friend of my mother's and got her out of Germany literally a few weeks before the war began. So it wasn't as if, you know, he was like many, there were certainly many upper-class Brits who were very keen on supporting Hitler. But there were so many young people wandering around, right?
Well,
to the eve of the war. Anyway.
It's a complicated and fascinating story, and if you want to know any more, you're going to have to come and buy the book. So Julia will be signing copies, and thank you all for listening and for your questions, and thank you, Julia.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.